This is John Amis talking about music from London. Today we have Peter Ustinov on opera and Bruce Hungerford and Michael Tippett talking about the piano music of Wagner. We start with a view of the critics. It's a slightly unusual view, the critics divided amongst themselves. When the music ends, the fun begins.
Last night, it was the splendid blaze, the weight and drive and urgency of the Fifth Symphony that precipitated the bravo storms from standing thousands.
For me, this was Beethoven drained of humanity. All its conflicts had been resolved, almost all its passion spent.
Complete disagreement among the professionals. 2 notices by 2 London critics, both of them reporting the same concert. And differences of this kind are by no means uncommon.
On the evidence of this performance, the Covent Garden chorus must receive serious attention. Lazy in attack and ensemble, careless of precise intonation, their singing showed little flexibility, intensity, or dramatic colour.
People who don't appreciate Covent Garden's chorus ought to be sentenced to 2 months at La Scala.
As you can hear, one man's meat is another man's poison.
The climax of the proceedings was Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. Rarely does one hear a performance of the work as satisfying as this, which beautifully related the mystery, the radiance, the homely humour, and the power.
This reading of Beethoven's Seventh was inoffensive but dull. It danced heavily with mud on its boots.
Notices like this have been appearing side by side for several years now in the monthly diary of concerts published by London's Royal Festival Hall. The feature's called Point and Counterpoint. And I'm going to ask the manager of the hall, T.E. Bean, if he'd like to tell us something about it.
Yes. The idea of it was this, that very often the criticism of a concert in one paper would be so diametrically opposed to the criticism of the concert in another paper that the listener who only read the one paper tended to get a quite unbalanced view of the critical appreciation of the concert. And we thought it would be useful both to the audience and to the critics if we could put side by side some of the comments made on concerts. And it has proved a highly attractive feature. In fact, I think I can say I've had more fan mail about Point and Counterpoint almost than I've had about the concerts themselves, which is rather sad, but it is a fact.
But if the public likes it, what about the critics? Wasn't there some reaction from them?
Oh, at the beginning there was a very violent reaction. So it surprised me because I should have thought that the critics of all people, knowing how valuable it is to the artist to have his work criticised, would appreciate that it can be equally valuable to the critic to have his work criticised. But that wasn't the reaction. It was regarded by some of them as a snide attack on criticism itself, which is nonsense. It was never intended as that. Well, all we want to do is to get people accustomed to the fact that there are many views, quite legitimate views and different views about interpretations of works, and it's very valuable to see them all before making your own judgment. You must, in the end, make your own judgment. You can only be your own critic. No one can criticise
I must
for
say,
you.
some of the things have made me laugh enormously. And also I like the way you've sometimes quoted critics of the past.
Yes,
like
well,
Shaw, like Newman, like your great Manchurian critic, Sammy Langford.
Yes. Well, I wanted it to be a positive work as well as a comparison of views. I wanted it to introduce a more positive tone. I wanted them to see some of the great writing that's been done in criticism in the past and today. And it's not always, therefore, just setting 2 views aside. If there's a fine piece of writing being done about criticism, about a concert, if it's possible, I like to quote quite extensively from it to show what can be done in making more alert the apprehension of the listener to what's going on the platform.
What do you think then should be the function of the music critic? Do you think the critics are doing their job today properly?
What is the job of a critic? I'm sure it isn't to put the dead body on the mortuary slab and give an X-ray of it. It's to treat it as a living experience, isn't it? And therefore his own personality comes into it. The music reflects back from him a vast experience of his own, and not only a cerebral experience, but an emotional one. Some of the best writing in criticism, I think, is where the critic just takes his courage in his hands and speaks about his own emotional reactions to the music without fear of being laughed at by the younger, more clinical-minded colleagues.
Do you think a critic ought to lead the public by the nose? I mean, ought to educate the public?
Well, if it starts with that, I think he'll not proceed far, because nobody likes to be educated, I think.
But then there's the problem of contemporary music.
Contemporary,
I mean,
well,
one can't. Virgil Thompson, talking about the same thing, said that you can't really be a critic unless you devote yourself to trying to understand contemporary music and making that clear to others.
Yes, well, isn't that true of all music, isn't it? Haven't you touched the point that he has to try to make explicit to others what is implicit, what they'll rise to on their toes when they recognise it? That's what Samuel Langford used to do. He used to write about things which you'd felt, but felt in an obscure, inarticulate sort of way, and you'd suddenly find that what you had been feeling in this very rough sort of way was suddenly made shiningly explicit. Well, that's what they ought to be doing for modern music as well as the old music.
Music criticism in Britain today is very much a young man's affair and monopoly. Some of these moulders of opinion were wearing school caps when the Hitler War ended. The development of the musical antennae has obviously proceeded at a gallop recently. For it's the new and fairly immature school of criticism that is able, on the face of it, to distinguish between the good and the not-so-good in Schoenberg. But in his 90th year, Ernest Newman confessed to me that though he'd intensively studied the scores of Schoenberg for 30 and more years, much of his language remained, as music, unintelligible or at best experimental. It is, of course, natural that a young and keen musician should be attracted to the kind of composition which openly engages curiosity into things technical and can without a blush be discussed without revealing imaginative perception. Much of the new music, being pioneer stuff, doesn't ask for criticism involving some deep experience of life, intellectual and emotional.
That's an opinion by Neville Cardus, as quoted in Point and Counterpoint. And to end with 3 more quotable points of view. From the London Observer.
It's a vulgar error, to which we critics are particularly prone, to suppose that there is one right way and one only in which to perform a piece of music. Any masterpiece has a variety of faces. That is the secret of their ability to fascinate generation after generation of listeners, each of which seeks out some different aspect of the work.
A quotation from Felix Weingartner, the conductor.
I don't think of beginning a useless war against the institution of criticism, as Don Quixote waged war against the windmills, but I content myself with giving this advice to the thinking part of the public. Don't believe every word you see against a work because it is printed. Rather form your own opinion of the work heard, thus making it possible for you to criticize even the criticism.
And a final word from the dramatist St. John Irvine.
The arts have flourished best in all ages of great criticism. When the critics are mealy-mouthed and unctuous and eager to keep in with prominent people, then, indeed, the arts decay.
Well, let's leave the critics to simmer in their own juice and hear something from that prince of jesters, Peter Ustinov. Film star, dramatist, actor, stage and film director, novelist. He's recently taken on a production of 3 operas at Covent Garden. Hugh Weldon set him off the other day by asking Ustinov if he shared the actor's usual sardonic approach to opera.
No, I think the sardonic attitude has really occurred because there are obviously elements in opera which can be comic, in that people are liable to be cast for their voices rather than for their physical appearances.
It isn't just physical appearance, in fact, is it? One of the things that makes up this sardonic attitude is the libretto.
Well, that of course is an enormous problem because it seems to me paradoxically that the libretto has to be of a certain, not inferior quality, but fairly simple very often in order to get a lyric drama across. What's happening nowadays is that the librettos are getting better and better, more and more almost like whodunits, which means that a lot of parlando has to be used to get over a point. And you get this kind of rather stylized thing, which is supposed to be based on speech patterns. I don't believe it if I say to you, "Why are you reading me all these bits of paper?" "I never did." "Oh, yes, you did." Well, that takes much longer than my saying to you, "Why are you reading me bits of paper?" And you say, "I never did." And I say, "Oh, yes, you did." So that really one has this stuff drawn out. There is an anguished inability to use a tune because it's old-fashioned. I think that's because we're under the influence of the critics very often, who instead of becoming, as they were in the old days, guardians of tradition that had to be fought, are now tend to be more radical than most composers and express disappointment if they aren't shocked at every moment.
Yes.
They're like diners that have eaten too much curry and can no longer taste an asparagus.
The stylized libretto, of course, isn't just just contemporary. I mean, Mozart is full of this sort of stuff, in fact.
Ah, yes, but he went very much quicker, so that if he had an aria, if the soprano was in the window and she was finishing her aria, you know, and she went, "Non sono più degli non posso più." She shut the window. Then you had to learn very quickly that her lover was coming back from the army, that the servant had tried to prepare the ground and had failed, and that the father didn't want the woman to marry. This had to be got on very quickly. So you got these very swift parlando passages, which you get occasionally on the radio, with a lot of knocking, which you can never understand when you're listening to it on the radio, and which, as soon as she shut the window, young man, another one come on and say, "Ma cosa fai? Niente farò. Oddio, il sogno mio. Io non sono niente. Addio. Io padre qui. Oh, che so sentito." Boom. And in those terribly short time, you've got over the whole plot. So now you're ready for a trio. And as soon as you finish that,
Yes.
oh, no. See. Off you go again. And you're ready for another set passage. It's much more economical.
How musical are you yourself? I mean, you've obviously got a marvelous ear. Are you musically trained?
No, I played the flute at school, but largely because there was no one else to play the flute. You know what happens in schools when there's a shortage of flutes.
You didn't keep the flute going.
I not only didn't keep the flute going, but as nature's given me a rather large and inflexible upper lip, I usually got the right note, but nearly always the wrong octave. So like nearly everybody else in the school orchestra, I pretended to play. And then I found I could do the flute better without the flute, too.
So you haven't got much academic training.
No, very, very little.
Yeah. Your wife said to me, I don't know whether this will take you by surprise, that I ought to ask you about the about singing lessons that you got.
Oh, did she?
Yes.
Yes. That was during the making of Quo Vadis, when Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had already spent quite a few millions on the film, and they thought they might as well do it properly. And they suddenly told me that I was to go to the Rome Opera and have 3 singing lessons from a certain maestro. And I arrived at the opera house. I asked for the maestro, and I passed by all these doors, behind which was the usual... That's an ideal place for a murder, of course, an opera. The body wouldn't be found for months later, because they're all doing it. And eventually I found the door in question, and I heard through the door with an upright piano going... No. Ancora più mandarin. So I thought I must interrupt them. I went in, and there was a contralto who looked at me rather annoyedly. Then the singing master looked at me and said, once he'd got rid of the lady, "I must tell you that 3 lessons is not possible, because to really sing, you must have a 6 year, and then perhaps." So I said, "I realize that. I'm just doing it because they asked me to." "And I also, because because I got a bambino along mine." So I said, "Well, I quite understand." So he said, "May I look at this score?" And the score was very modern. And he looked at it and was already in difficulties because he couldn't... Anyway, we went through it, and then he said, "Remember always, in the first lesson, to breathe with the forehead. Always breathe with the forehead." So I tried to give the impression there was a pulse in there. At the end of the second lesson, he said, "You're already beginning to breathe with the forehead. Now you must think with the stomach. Breathe with the forehead, think with the stomach." I said, "Fine." And at the third lesson, he said, before leaving him for good, he said, "Now remind me what I've told you." I said, "I've got to breathe with the forehead." "Bravo!" I said, "and I've got to think with the stomach." "If I had more time, what we would do with you. How quick. But remember one thing which is the most important. Whatever happens, if you forget the line, if you cannot hear the prompt, always dominate, always sing with the eyes."
Well, I think we need more Ustinovs in music and less professionals. Now, another thing I've always thought is that it would be a nice idea to build up a program of unlikely music. Chopin's choral music, for example, Verdi's string quartet, and perhaps Wagner's piano music. This piano music of Wagner's, every bit of it, was recorded by an Australian-American pianist called Bruce Hungerford. He teaches every summer at the master classes at Bayreuth and knows the Wagners. Mr. Hungerford, tell me, what's the setup there? Do the Wagners really live like the royal family of Bayreuth? Is the atmosphere rather holy?
Oh, definitely. Oh,
Do they genuflect when the Wagners come down the street?
No, it's it's not quite as much as that, but oh, the Wagners are really the royal family. There's no question about it.
Tell me about these master classes at Bayreuth. What exactly are they, and when were they started?
Well, they were originally started around the turn of the century. Cosima, Wagner's widow, wanted to carry out a plan which was originally part of Wagner's conception for Bayreuth. That is, to keep training young artists for Bayreuth, the singers, the stage designers, conductors, and everything in connection with the Festspielhaus. Now, Friedland Wagner, who is Wagner's granddaughter, the daughter of Siegfried Wagner.
She's the one who lives in America.
That's right. She came back to Bayreuth in '53 for the first time after the war, and she has taken only artists who are really ready to go before the public.
In other words, professionals rather than young students.
Really, yes, professionals or almost professionals. And she has expanded the idea. Not only are the master classes for conductors and singers, but she also has a school of architecture. These people study acoustics of hall building and all that kind of thing.
And of course they're allowed into the performances.
Yes, that's wonderful. So they have facilities for getting into the rehearsals, and they sit in the lighting towers and down in the orchestra, and they really get to know what goes on.
Now tell me about these records that you've made in connection with Bayreuth Festival.
Yes, well...
This is all Wagner's piano music, is it?
Yes, the complete things. 3 sonatas, a fantasy, and several smaller pieces. And Friedland wanted to... She has to put this festival master classes on some kind of a financial standing, and so she decided, for the beginning anyhow, to make records. And the first thing she thought, well, let's get all the piano pieces together. Several of the things I had to learn from the manuscript. We just got a photocopy from the archives, and of course Wagner's writing is so beautiful that it's not at all difficult to just read it off.
Very early works, aren't they?
Most of them are, yes. The 3 big works were written when he was 18. And then you jump over to 1853 with a sonata for Matilda Wesendonck, which he wrote before Tristan. And then the last thing is probably the most absolutely Wagnerian of all. That's an Albumblatt for Betty Schott, the wife of Wagner's publisher. This is a beautiful piece based on one of the motives from the Siegfried Idyll.
Are these records going to be generally available to the public?
Yes, they are indeed. You can't buy them in the shops, though. They're available only from Bayreuth. People who want them must write direct to Friedland Wagner, the Bayreuth Festival Masterclasses, Bayreuth, Germany.
I remember once meeting Friedland Wagner and gaping at her quite speechlessly because she looked so incredibly like the great composer, her great-grandfather, is it, or grandfather? But now, let us consider the actual piano music. Or rather, let Michael Tippett, our famous British composer, consider the matter for us.
We do not associate Wagner with the piano, but with the voice and the orchestra, for the very good reason that in the field of 19th century opera, Wagner is one of the two incontestably progressive giants, the other being Verdi, while in the field of the piano Wagner stands nowhere. When he was 18, that is in 1831, Wagner had the luck to find a really good teacher, Theodor Weinlig, cantor at the Thomasschule in Leipzig, and Wagner never forgot him. He told Edward Dannreuther in 1877, that is when he, Wagner, was 64, quite a lot about Weinlig. And though what he said then is well known, it's rewarding to quote Wagner at some length. This, then, is what Wagner told Dannreuther. Weinlig had no special method, but he was clear-headed and practical. Indeed, you cannot teach composition. You may show how music gradually came to be what it is, and thus guide a young man's judgment, but this is historical criticism and cannot directly result in practice. All you can do is to point to some working example, some particular piece, set a task in that direction, and correct the pupil's work. This is what Weinlig did with me. He chose a piece, generally something of Mozart's, drew attention to its construction, relative length and balance of sections, principal modulations, number and quality of themes, and general character of the movement. Then he set the task. You shall write about so many bars, divided so many sections with modulations to correspond. The theme shall be so many of such and such a character. The true lesson consisted, it is still Wagner speaking, in Weinlig's patient and careful inspection of what had been written. That is an extremely interesting account of how the young Wagner was taught the fundamentals of composition. I have always treasured this record of what Wagner said, because I was taught in exactly the same way. I also consider Weinlig's method to be exactly what Wagner's eventual genius needed. Later, it was no longer Weinlig setting the task to Wagner, but Wagner setting the task to Wagner. And no longer a task of imitation, but a task of invention. Yet the method of carrying out the task remains, both in principle and details, the same. Even in a huge piece of construction like the 4 operas of the Ring, Wagner drew his own attention, before beginning actual composition of the music, to relative length and balance of sections, principal modulations, number and quality of the themes, and general character of the movement. I will return to this later. For the moment, I should first recall that Weinlig chiefly chose the music of Mozart for model, because I fancy one could guess that from this short quotation from Wagner's sonata in B-flat major, but there are also echoes of both Beethoven and Schubert. I am quite certain in my own mind that had it been necessary, Wagner really could have composed splendid music for the piano. By necessary, I mean essential to the expression of what he had to say. The piano was never in this sense essential to him. The orchestra was. Perhaps this point needs a bit of amplification. Clearly, composers are in a kind of counterpoint with their age. Some, like Bach, are consummatory, and some, like Wagner, are inventors. When Bach died, the spirit of the time let him drop into obscurity, for the new styles immediately superseded him. It took 150 years to bring his music back into the living center. When Wagner died, the spirit of the time pushed his music for a while more and more into the centre, so that his influence on the immediately following generations of composers was tremendous, only to be broken by as violent a reaction. The necessary, the essential to Bach was just this consummation of all that had gone before, even if it forced him to appear behind his time. The necessary and essential to Wagner was the search for new and unexplored means of expression for a virtually quite new genre of opera, so that he appeared, both to himself and others, ahead of his time. The new kind of opera did not need the piano, but certainly needed a new and more opulent orchestra. It is my belief that what Wagner learnt through Weinlig was absolutely essential to him and basic. Now, although the model was Mozart, the Mozart of the instrumental pieces, one guesses, yet it is also the way Wagner composed all his life, even in his biggest works. He assembled in advance exactly the required number of themes of varying character and quality, and with these alone he composed the entire piece. It is this essential ground plan of music, learnt through Weinlig and demonstrated scholastically in the first piano sonata, which enables Wagner to give the wonderful, formal coherence to such a splendid piece of orchestral music as this from The Ring, Siegfried's Journey to the Rhine. For all that Weinlig was of the 18th century, he would have approved.
Siegfried continues on his way down the Rhine, with Furtwängler conducting, as we end today's Talking About Music. You also heard Ernest Bean pointing and counterpointing at the critics, Peter Ustinov being his inimitable self, and Bruce Hungerford and Michael Tippett dealing with Wagner's piano music. So, goodbye from London.